equality, equity, that's worse, right? Equity means equality of outcome. It means that every single organization has 50% women and 50% men. Doesn't matter whether the men and women differ in their intrinsic preferences, which, by the way, they do. The scientific literature on that is completely clear. It was established by the early 90s. It was established in the Scandinavian countries, where they've done most to flatten out the socioeconomic differential, say, between men and women. Didn't get rid of the differences between men and women. In fact, they became exaggerated. The biggest personality differences in the world between men and women are in Scandinavia, just as the biggest differences in interest between men and women are in Scandinavia. Because when you get rid of the sociocultural differences between men and women, the biological differences don't disappear, they maximize. How else could it be? And as I said, the literature on that is clear, and the way that the postmodernist radicals react to that is by criticizing the scientific method itself. On their computers, which only work, of course, because the scientific method actually works. So, you hear the egalitarian clarion call everywhere. Everything should be equal. Everything should be equally distributed. We should strive for equity. It's like, wrong. Especially if you're a conservative. Wrong. What we want are just hierarchies of competence. Not everyone's a neurosurgeon. You know, if your father has a brain tumor, you probably want a hierarchy of competence for neurosurgeons, so you can pick the one that's the best, so that he might not die. That's what a hierarchy of competence is for. For the postmodernists, there's no hierarchy that isn't based on power. Well, because they think the world runs on power. And that's why they're willing to use power to get what they want, because it's the only thing they believe in. But a valid hierarchy of competence, it's, God, we need those things, man. We need the best plumbers. We need the best contractors. We need the best, we need the best carpenters. We need the best lecturers. There has to be a hierarchy of quality. And not only so that we know who the best are and can reward them properly, but so that we can reward them so they keep being the best. It's like, you know, if you have a great educator, if you have a great leader, if you have a great thinker, you want to reward them so they keep thinking and they keep educating so they can tell you something. It's not a reward for their intrinsic being. It's a calculated move on your part to suck everything out of them that's valuable as fast as you can. That's what a hierarchy of competence is for. And the idea that hierarchies of competence don't exist it's so cynical. It's such a pathologically cynical idea. And it's actually quite patently untrue, because here's an interesting tidbit from the psychological literature. Let's say you want to determine what the best predictors are for lifetime success in a Western society. Well, what would you hope for? How about intelligence? There'd be a good one. Let's hope the smart people occupy more positions of complexity, right? Because they're smarter. Would you want it any other way? Okay, and that's great. The number one predictor of accomplishment in Western societies is intelligence. So that means the system works. What's the number two predictor? Conscientiousness. Well, what's that? It's a trait marker for hard work. So who gets ahead? Smart people who work hard. Now, that doesn't account for every bit of the difference between people in terms of their hierarchical structure, because hierarchies aren't perfect. They're corrupt. People get to the top sometimes because they're psychopathic, although, believe me, a hell of a lot less than you think. Because a psychopath has to keep moving from place to place, because once he reveals himself as deceitful and untrustworthy, he has to go find new suckers to fleece. So the idea that, you know, there's no distinction between a CEO and a psychopath, it's like, that's only made by someone who A, knows nothing about psychopaths, B, knows nothing about CEOs, and C, has something fundamental against the entire capitalist structure, because it's simply not true. Corrupt, sometimes, greedy, sometimes, short-sighted, sometimes running companies that are doing their best to auger themselves into the ground, and so, you know, it's bad people running a dying organization. But generally speaking, it's not the case. Our hierarchies of competence are reasonably functional. And not only are they functional, they're valuable. We need to know who the competent people are, and we need to reward them. And even more importantly, we need to tell young people, hey, there's some hierarchies of competence out there. Like 1,000 of them. Go be a plumber, man. But be a good one, you know? Be an honest one. I had a plumber once, you know? It was the night before we were putting drywall in our house. We were redoing a house, and he had put in all the plastic piping, you know, and I was going to test the joints. They're supposed to be glued together with this pipe glue, right? And I told him I had to test the joints, and he said, well, you don't have to test my joints, they never leak. And I thought, yeah, that's okay. How about if I test them? So I went up on the 3rd floor and filled the pipes with water, capping them in the basement like you're supposed to. And like half an hour later, I had 2 inches of water in the basement. There were 30 leaking joints. And that was the night before the drywallers were supposed to show up. So he wasn't particularly competent. That's the point of that story. But even more so, he had put a bunch of the plastic pipe outside where the drywall would be. So it would have been sticking through the wall. So I spent a frenetic night, you know, sawing through plastic pipe and re-gluing joints so that the drywallers could come in. What's the point? If you're going to be a plumber, man, be a good plumber. Because otherwise all you do is go out there and cause trouble. And we don't need people to cause more trouble. We need people to solve problems. You know, and so you can be a tradesman, and you can make a lot of money as a tradesperson. It's a bloody, reliable, honorable, forthright, productive way of making a living. And there is a hell of a lot of difference between a working man who knows what he's doing and one who doesn't, both in terms of skill and ethics, right? And you work with someone who knows what they're doing, it's a bloody pleasure. They tell you what they're going to do, they tell you how much it will cost, they go and do it, it works, and you pay them. Perfect. Everyone's happy. And that's what happens when you have genuine hierarchies of competence. And so you listen to these panderers of egalitarianism and equity, and they fail to recognize completely that there are differences in rank between people. It's not such a terrible thing, man. Maybe you wouldn't be a great lawyer. Like, it's certainly possible. Most people aren't. But that doesn't mean there isn't something you could be great at. There's lots of hierarchies to attempt to climb, and if you fail in one, go try in another. But the point is, you're still trying to aim for the top, and what the hell are you going to do if you don't try to aim for the top? You know, flap about uselessly and whine about your life? It's not helpful. It'll just make you miserable. You're not reliable to anyone. You can't help out in a crisis. It's like, so you tell young people, and this is another message for conservatives, like, I don't care what you're going to do, but go out there and make something of yourself for God's sake. Be an honest person and work and get to the top of whatever it is that you want to get to the top of. You know, and stand up for yourself like a respectable human being and be a bit of a light on the world instead of a blight. You know, and you can tell young people that, and they haven't been told that by anyone now. And so the young men are so hungry for that it's painful to watch. They're so relieved when someone finally comes up and says, hey, you know, you get your act together a bit, discipline yourself, see if you can learn to tell the truth, concentrate on something for a year or two, you could be a bloody world beater. They think, really? That's possible? Wow, that would be interesting. That might make life worth living. It's like, yeah, it might. So why don't you go do it? That's what the damn universities were supposed to be teaching people, and they've forgotten that. I went to Harvard a month and a half. I used to teach there, and I talked to a bunch of students, you know, and I told them, it's not easy to get into Harvard, you know. Like, you're a valedictorian if you're at Harvard. And not only are you a valedictorian, you're way better than most people at least 2 other things, or you don't get in. And so, like, I don't know what the acceptance rate is, like 5%, and believe me, not everybody applies, so it's a very selective school. And so why am I saying that? It's like, these are high quality kids. So I told them what I just told you. It's like, here you are at Harvard. It's like, get yourself educated, man. Read some books, learn to talk, learn to think. Make yourself into something. Get the hell out there and make the world that put you here happy that you were put there in that great institution. You know, and they came up to me afterwards and said, God, I wish someone would have told us that when we were in our first year. It's like, Jesus, why didn't someone tell them that? For God's sake, it's supposed to be the greatest university in the world. Is it so difficult to figure that out? Well, it is if that isn't what you want to have happen in the university. You want to make cringing milksops who whine about being victims while they're going to Ivy League institutions. Jesus, it's pathetic. There's an old idea from Carl Jung. I really like this idea. It's a rough one, man. It's like a psychotherapeutic scalpel. Let's say someone's doing something to you don't understand. It's producing nothing but misery as an outcome. You think, what the hell is your motivation? They won't tell you. Maybe they don't know. So Carl Jung's advice was, look at the outcome and infer the motivation. Okay, so you produce a generation of students privileged beyond belief in comparison to the rest of like struggling humanity in all of history. You put them in Ivy League schools and they come out thinking that they're members of an oppressed group and victims. It's like, well, why would that happen? And the answer is, well, that's what the people who taught them wanted to turn them into. And then you might think, well, did they do that because they cared for them? It seems bloody unlikely to me. You take this great raw material, right? I mean, it's taken a lot of work to make an institution like the University of Toronto or like Harvard. We've been working on that for thousands of years. And you invite people in, you think, God, we selected you so carefully because we think you could be a world beater. And then what we do is, we don't teach you how to think, we don't teach you how to speak, we don't get you to read great books, and we convince you that you're a victim and that your culture is corrupt. It's like, great. Well, those people are no friends of those institutions, I can tell you that, and they're even less friends of those students. So hierarchies of competence are desirable, and they should be promoted. So none of this idiot egalitarian equity. It's not good for anyone. First of all, it's impossible. Second, it would be murderous to impose. But third, even if it succeeded, it would fail. As fast as it succeeded, that would be how fast it would fail. Why would you strive for anything if there was no up to strive for? If everything's flat and equal, well, when you're starving or dying, then everyone's equal. And believe me, the egalitarian totalitarians who dominated the 20th century knew perfectly well how to make people equal. And they made them equal in gulag work camps and in starvation. And I'm sure we could attain that if we wanted to. So, all right.
But so I feel like it's that approach that is also bothering me.
Yeah.
This approach where it's like I'm gonna rationalize this situation as a white man, a white academic man.
Now I gotta stop you there.
Can I?
You just for a second.
Okay.
Because I never introduced race into this dialogue, and I'm not treating you like a black woman. I'm treating you like a human being. And so to introduce race into the dialogue, I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it's helpful for what you're after, and that's partly why I'm doing this. I think that our society has become so obsessed with group identity that we're pushing in a counterproductive direction.
Okay, so I think that I disagree with that.
Yeah, fair enough.
Because I bring my lived experience into everything that I do as a black woman.
Yeah.
The way that I view this world, the oppression that I feel, and the way that I operate and maneuver is very much as a black woman. I was racialized. I've been made aware of my race in a lot of ways. Right?
Are you a student?
No.
Oh. Just curious.
Yeah, I just like to follow.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think it's important to acknowledge your circle of competence.
Yeah.
And so to speak on things in such a sterile way, to discredit it, it's not an argument for me. The oppression, the need to talk about it.
No, definitely not. Definitely not discrediting it. I think that, and I'm glad that you're here, and I think that talking about oppression is just exactly what we need. What we don't need is failure to talk about oppression.
Okay, so what's your main argument? Is your main argument that the legislation needs to be clearer, or is it the fact that they're they're criminalizing people that they're potentially going to criminalize people that don't have intent? That don't have
speak
intent.
the right word. That's my problem. They're going to criminalize not speaking the correct words. And we're not doing that. I'm not doing that. I can tell you that. That's not a good thing.
Okay.
And the fact that it happens to arise out of this particular issue, you know, the transgender issue, it has to arise somewhere. But I think that the principle that I'm discussing transcends any of the localized elements of its argument.
Okay, so I feel like that is a valid argument where it's like, I feel like making sure that the legislation is clear in defining what is hate speech. And
actually, I just assume we got rid of the whole hate speech thing, because I think it's unbelievably dangerous to drive people who hate underground and not let them talk. And it's partly because you don't know where they are, and you don't know what they're doing, and you can't refute them.
Okay, but so I think where I draw the most issues I was like, okay, the core of your argument makes sense. I can kind of understand it.
Okay.
But where you draw that line, I don't understand. Like
Yeah.
the example you
Look,
use,
that's
I'm
a
not
tough
using
one.
gender
That's a tough
pronouns. Like I just don't get it.
Yeah.
At all.
Oh, well, I can tell you a bunch of things about that briefly. I'm going to just stick to the one thing for now.
Okay.
I think that we are in danger of crossing a very dangerous legislative line. There are reasonable restrictions that can be placed on what people can say, can't say. But you cannot force people to mouth words. It's not good. And seriously, the transgender issue, there's another issue associated with that. And the issue is that we don't understand the biological or cultural foundations of human sexuality well enough, in any sense of the word, to bring premature closure to the discussion. We are actually doing that. So
in that argument, I don't think it doesn't hold much validity to me, because for a person that is in the oppressed community or that feels oppressed, right?
yeah.
If they're asking for, so to that answer, I said to what end? So to what end? So at the end of this,
that's the question.
Right, but so it's like at the end of all this research,
I'm not.
and you conclude whatever you need to conclude in order to rationalize it.
Well,
These people are still in the same reality.
I'm being
still
asked.
the same.
I understand that. I understand that, but I do not believe that the way forward for those communities is down that path. It's not a path that's going to be good for anyone.
And so this is where I come back to this framework of like
Look,
operating from
wrong.
a specific place, right? It's like, so you as a person, as this person that has so much privilege and has never really had to internalize oppression the way that an oppressed community has.
Well, you don't know much about my background, so I wouldn't make presumptions.
Okay, but I'm saying the way that oppressed community has. So we live in a white supremacist society. That's just
don't buy it. We don't live in a white supremacist society.
Okay.
No, look. If you think this is a white supremacist society, you should read some history.
Can I just finish my argument? So this is my argument, and then this is probably where the disagreement occurs.
Yeah.
But so I feel like as that person, you can't speak for a community that has already organized and spoken about what they need in order to.
Why should I assume that the people who are speaking for that community are valid representatives of the community? Merely because they put themselves forward as that? We have a democracy so that people can elect representatives that have credibility. Anybody can stand up and say, I'm representing community X. That doesn't give them legitimacy apart from the integrity of their argument. So I'm not convinced at all that the people who are speaking out on behalf of X community are legitimate representatives of those communities. Just because they happen to belong. Like, I'm not a legitimate representative of white men. I'm just me. Now, I also have to be white since we have to have that discussion. But that doesn't make me representative of white people. Or it does. If it does, it does in such a staggeringly peripheral way.
No, but it doesn't.
I know you're good. I know who you are, Jordan Peterson.
You did a phenomenal job of articulating your arguments. So keep it.
I was wrong. Keep the girls out. Keep the Roman Empire pure.
I'll follow this.
Yeah, well.
I know right on it.
Yeah.
I'm a racial realist, okay? This is real.
Dr. Peterson, I have a lot of questions that arise from your comments at the Balfour 100 event, your M103 video, your recent discussion with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and your comments on Islam in the West in general. And in your comments, there's this common theme that one of these things is not like the other. You put the Judeo-Christian tradition on the one side and Islam on the other. Specifically, the, quote, complex problem of Islam and the, quote, as a, quote, totalizing system. And before I go further, let me state that if hypothetically, a final analysis of Islam resulted in as total a denunciation as your analysis of postmodernism or neo-Marxism, I wouldn't be personally offended at all. This isn't a personal question. In your recent interview with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, she said, Western values are superior to Islamic law and Islamic values. I agree with that, basically, certainly in the context of, let's say, current global affairs. I'll skip the quotes from a Reason magazine interview, but you should read them because hers is a worldview which is very much the West versus Islam, not radical Islam, but Islam, including necessarily the military option. So my question is, at the level of psychological significance of these stories, at the level of mythology and archetype, how is Islam so different from the Judeo-Christian tradition? You know, because Adam, Eve, Ava, Satan, Shaitan, so on and so forth, everything from the fall to the flood. A lot of what you discuss in this lecture series is necessarily part of Islam as well. And in fact, I think one of the strongest criticisms of Islam is that it's perhaps pretty unoriginal. You know, tonight you said that the moral presuppositions of a culture are instantiated in its stories. I see a lot of the same stories. So current global affairs aside, I'm asking at the deepest levels, how different are these stories and the moral presuppositions?
Okay, well, that's a killer question. Well, okay, so the first thing I would say is, fundamentally, I don't know. And so part of the reason that one of the things I'm planning to do is to have a series of discussions. And plenty of people have contacted me about discussing with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, because as you know, she has powerful and serious foes. And they're not happy with her black and white distinction. And so, now I read Infidel, and I really liked that book. Like my sense was that she was a heroine. Now, what that means in relationship to Islam, that's a different story, because she came out of a totalitarian, let's say, family structure in a relatively totalitarian society. And you could make the case that there's a correspondence between that and Islam, and you could make the case that there isn't. And of course, that's the critical issue. And so, there's a couple of things that I can't wrap my head around easily in relationship to Islam. And so one is what I see as the failure to separate church from state. And that's a problem. Now, it may not be a problem as such, but it's certainly a problem in relationship to the relation between Islam and the West, because we separate church from state. Now, there's fundamentalists in the United States, Christian fundamentalists, who think that that separation is a mistake. So it's not only an idea that's rooted in Islam that those should be united. But it's definitely a problem with regards to our coexistence, because that's a fundamentally different presumption. Okay, so that's problem number one. Problem number two for me, and again, this may be a consequence of my ignorance, which I'm trying to rectify. Muhammad was a warlord. And I don't know what to do about that fact. Like, one thing you can say about Christ, hypothetically, let's say, I'm not talking about a historical reality necessarily, although I'm not denying it either, is that of all the things he was, warlord was definitely not one of them. And I don't know what to do about that. And so I don't know how to reconcile that. And I don't know how to reconcile, like, not only was Muhammad a warlord, which I don't think is an unreasonable thing to proclaim, the expansion that he initiated was unbelievably successful. I mean, within 600 years, it was the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And it demolished Byzantine Christianity, which is something that Western people don't even know. You know, I've read thinkers who said that the West was so traumatized, culturally, let's say, by the demolition of Byzantine Christianity, that we can't even study it now. And so, I don't know if that's true, but I don't know that it's not true either. And the Buddhists were wiped out of Afghanistan, and we saw that echoed in the Taliban's destruction of those great Buddhist monuments. And so what I'm hoping is that there's a bridge. There better be a bridge. And that's why I want to have these discussions, because I'd like to understand if there's a bridge. And so lots of people have sent me people who I should talk to, who they think represent Islam far better than Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And perhaps they're correct, and hopefully I'll get an opportunity to talk to them, because I would like to know why. I would like to know if what I think is wrong. Because if it's wrong, it's important that I know it's wrong. But at the moment, I don't know it's wrong, and B, I don't see I'm not sure what it signifies. So, and I don't think anyone is sure, right? Because we have this entangling of the civilizations. You know, and there's other things too, like, I'm not very happy with the Saudi Arabs and the Wahhabis. I don't think they're our allies. I don't see how any Western woman can possibly think that they're our allies. And I'm not happy with the fact that the petrodollars that we send them are transformed in substantial part into the kind of propaganda that's definitely a threat to the West. And I'm not very happy with the fact that our politicians appear stupidly blind to that. Now, that may again be a consequence of my ignorance. It's certainly possible. But those are the sorts of things that I can't reconcile. And so, you know, I've also seen parallels between the ideas that I'm presenting here and other religious traditions, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism. It's harder for me to bridge the gap with Islam, and I'm not sure why that is. I think it has something to do with the things that I just laid out. Now, what I don't know about Islam would fill very many volumes, many of which I have sitting on my shelves at home right now because I want to do the reading, you know, as I progress through this. But, yeah.
Well, I suppose the first, let's say if I was going to oppose that statement, I would say, well, perhaps it's a propagandistic, what would you call it, conspiracy to blame what's happening in Europe on Islamic immigrants. I guess part of the problem is that, at least as far as I can tell, the news has become sufficiently unreliable because it's so polarized that we can't really tell what's going on. I mean, I think the reason that Europe is clamping down on speech critical of Islam is partly the same reason that the entire Western world is clamping down on speech that's critical of anything that is associated with group identity, which is pretty much any set of ideas that unites people. And it's a consequence of the collective decision that we've made that egalitarianism and conflict avoidance constitute the two highest virtues, and they trump everything else, including free speech. Now, why that's happened is a very, very difficult thing to say. I mean, I suspect to some degree that it's a consequence of women becoming involved in the political system, which is something that we've never experienced before. And women are more agreeable by nature than men, and agreeable people are compassionate towards those they see as suffering, and that seems to include any minority, especially when you combine that with a kind of neo-Marxist doctrine that claims that anyone who has an advantage swiped it. And I think in the Islamic situation you get a real conflict there, because it's obviously the case that many Islamic practices are not commensurate with postmodern neo-Marxist feminism, let's say, but they seem to get a free pass. And I guess that's because the idea that all cultures are equal trumps the requirement for human rights for women. And maybe the other thing that's even darker is that there's a fair bit of revolutionary fervor in the more radical end of the left political spectrum, and that radical fervor is devoted towards tearing down the patriarchy, and of course that's basically Western civilization. And so because Islam isn't part of Western civilization, then it can be seen as an ally in that attempt. That's what it looks like to me. I also think, that ignorance and all of that contribute. It isn't obvious that people who are afraid of such things as Islamophobia really understand anything about Islam. I wouldn't say I understand anything about Islam, even though I've read a fair bit about it. It's very difficult to put yourself inside a different belief system. I'm somewhat apprehensive about Islam because it looks to me like it's a totalizing system as well as a religion, and it's a totalizing system because everything has to come under its purview, including law and everything that goes along with that. There's no separation between church and state, and so I don't see how that's commensurate with a Western mode of existence. And I don't think people want to have that conversation because they want to say, well, no, everyone, diverse as they are and important as that diversity is, apparently such that everyone has to be represented equally, the diversity isn't really about anything fundamental, and we can all get along without a problem. And I'm afraid that that's extraordinarily naive. And then I suppose there's also an element of something like Western guilt, I guess, perhaps, for what has been described as our imperialist past. There's been a very long-term assault on the, what would you call, on the morality of the West. We're often viewed as the rapers and pillagers of the world, and that sort of goes along with the environmentalist ethos. And so I think we do have a fair bit of guilt about that, whether it's warranted or not. I mean, history is a bloody nightmare, and it doesn't matter where you look. And I would say at least the West has brought advantages along with its disadvantages. And I think that our attitude towards individuality is fundamentally correct and absolutely vital. And I would also say that the only countries in the world that are essentially worth living in any real sense, are the ones that are predicated on the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Okay, maybe at this point we could turn to the audience for another question. A quick question, please. Maybe someone from the back, a little bit. Not too back.
From so you oppressed people at the back.
Hi, Jordan. My question is, what is the antidote towards toxic masculinity?
Well, the antidote is responsible masculinity. And what does responsible mean? It means, well, if you're responsible, then you're trying to do what's honest first. So you're careful with your speech and your actions. You're careful with your speech in that you don't say things that you know to be false. And you're careful in your actions so that you don't have to lie about what you do. That's a good start. And then the next thing would be that you're capable of taking responsibility for yourself, at least, so that once you're an adult, no one else has to bend over backwards to ensure that you don't unduly suffer in the world. And so that's responsibility for yourself. And then if you get halfway good at that, well, then, you might think about taking on the responsibility of a family and contributing to your community and doing all those things in a harmonious manner. And that's obviously the antidote to toxic masculinity, which is not a phrase I would generally use. I just think about it as, what would you call it? I think sinful behavior is a much more accurate representation, personally, but it's honesty and responsibility. And I do think about it as a function of harmony. I got that a lot from reading Jean Piaget, whose work was a psychological extension of Kant's categorical imperative. Because Kant believed that you should act in a manner such that if the way you acted became a universal, that would be beneficial. But Piaget formalized that very nicely, showing that one of the bases for the emergence of a system of genuine ethics was an iterable form of reciprocity. So that, so for example, I can give you a quick example of that. My granddaughter, who's now 15 months old, has discovered a new game, and it's a Piagetian game, a developmental game, and she discovered this by watching, but also on her own, and partly because it's a very deep part of human nature. So she has this little wooden spoon, and her game is, you sit with her at the table, and her game is, she gives you the spoon, and then you take it, and then you give it back, and then she's all happy about that, and then she gives the spoon to the person who's sitting beside her, and then they give it back to her, and she's very happy about that. And so it's an amazing game because she's learned to give up something, to let go of something that she wants, and to trust someone else to return it to her, and that's what she's playing with. And then you can play with that game. It's quite fun. So, and you have to pay careful attention to her and watch how she's manifesting her emotions. And so maybe what you do is you take the spoon and you hide it under your hand. That sort of disconcerts her a bit. Then you show it to her and pick it up and give it to her, and she's happy about that because what she sees is that the principle of reciprocity can maintain itself across a set of transformations, and that's really exciting to her. Or you can give her the spoon and she can give it back to you, and then she can reach for it and you can pull it away 1/4 inch, and that sort of disconcerts her, and then she'll You want to repeat that?
I'm sorry. I said that didn't cover really toxic masculinity, right? Because
Yes, it's dealing with
the
just dealing with the principle of reciprocity.
You just said that you have to be honest and responsible as a man, right?
Well, put it this way: when I'm giving the spoon back to my granddaughter, I'm not engaging in toxic masculinity. And that was the point that I was trying to make, is that, and this deep reciprocity and trust is part of the social contract, and it is precisely the antidote to what precisely, since we're going to pursue this, what precisely is toxic masculinity, as opposed to, say, toxic femininity or toxic humanity? What exactly are you asking me about?
I really want to know what you like, how you would describe toxic masculinity. Because
No, I want you to define what toxic masculinity constitutes. Since we're going to define things so carefully, let's do it.
Well, I think.
Okay, guys, sorry, but we really have to move on. So there will be more questions later on. There will be a lot of opportunities.
No,
to
but
ask
maybe
questions.
let's, if you. Okay, so let's define it shortly.
All right, shortly, please.
Okay, I think that the moment when you kind of, I have a hard time to kind of describe it in English. Let's say, that you kind of go over a boundary that kind of neglects the freedom of the opposite, well, gender or whatsoever. So that's toxic masculinity, and that you kind of have.
But
this
that would also be toxic femininity.
Well, may I like finish my sentence,
Sure.
please? Thank you. And then also, I lost my sentence now. But no, I will be back. I'm back. But more in the sense that, yeah, can someone help me here in the audience?
Okay, so before we move on, let me point something out. That I was willing to undertake this line of discussion, allowing for the possibility that the category of toxic masculinity had some content, right? But if we're going to pursue that line of reasoning and quibble about the answer, then we're certainly going to quibble about the definition that's embedded in the question. And so part of what's happened in our discourse is that we're required ethically to assume a priori, merely out of politeness, that the utterance toxic masculinity actually constitutes a meaningful phrase. And if you push it, you find very rapidly that it doesn't, because it's very, very, very difficult to define, and definitions actually matter. And so if it's a matter of transgressing against the boundaries of gender-appropriate behavior, well, first of all, that indicates that there's something universal and normative about gender-appropriate behavior, which is something that people who push the idea of toxic masculinity generally tend not to presume. And second, it's just as likely to happen among women as among men, in which case it's not toxic masculinity. So maybe on to the next question.
Okay.